remember while I was at uni, my lesson plans were like 3 pages long. Now as a teacher, lucky if I have a sentence or two. I always remember observing teachers while I was a trainee and thinking, how do they do that? How are they so good at that? This is something which has all come with experience. Today I'm going to be talking you through in detail how I lesson plan. Hi everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Miss Ross. If you didn't already know, then I am a Scottish primary teacher. Although this video is going to be based around my experiences teaching the Scottish curriculum for excellence, I'm still going to include a lot of my tips for lesson planning and show you my process, so I'm sure it will still be helpful for my non-Scottish teaching friends. Also just want to add a little bit of a disclaimer, I am a recently qualified teacher, so I'm still learning myself. You know, I'm not an expert, but I have been teaching full time for almost 2 years now, and I'd like to think that I do have some knowledge of the curriculum that we use here. I did a 4-year BA primary education course with literacy at the University of the West of Scotland. I graduated in 2019 and last year was my NQT or my training year. And since I did the 4-year course, I do feel like I've had a lot of experience of lesson planning so far. There's a lot of tips and tricks that I've picked up along the way, and today hopefully I'm going to be sharing some of that with you all. So if you didn't already know, then Curriculum for Excellence in Scotland is split into different standard levels. Children in Scotland attend primary school for 7 years from primary 1 all the way up to primary 7, and then they progress on to secondary school about the age of 11-12. We have different levels depending on the stage that you're going to be teaching in. I've got a little diagram that I'll hopefully put on screen now so that I can break it down a little bit more easily for you. Children start off their education journey in an early years centre or a nursery. Early level is carried on through primary 1 as well. So by the end of primary 1, pupils are hoping to have achieved early level and they will progress on to first level. First level is achieved across primary 2, primary 3 and primary 4, and then after that pupils progress on to second level. I'm actually currently teaching primary 7, which is the oldest pupils in the school, and we're actually touching into third level a little bit just to give pupils some challenge before they move into secondary school, which I'm not really going to be discussing today since my expertise lies in primary, but hopefully that just gives you a little bit of a breakdown of how the stages look in the primary school. Something that you need to be aware of is that there is potential you could be teaching in a composite class, which is a class that teaches across sometimes 2, sometimes more than 2 stages. So I know that in my current school we have composite primary 4-5 classes, which has pupils that are in primary 4 and pupils that are in primary 5 in the same classroom sharing the same teacher. I actually did a placement in a small rural school where we had multi-composite classes where primary 1, 2 and 3 were all within the same classroom. But it's important to note that even if you are teaching a straight primary 7 class, then that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a huge range of ability in your class. Not every pupil will necessarily be working at the stage that is expected for their age range, and there might be different reasons for that, including pupils having an additional support need. But most of the pupils in your class should be working towards a particular level. As a result of the needs in your classroom, you might have to differentiate your tasks, which just means cater to the needs of the learners in your class, and that can be through providing additional support or through providing additional challenge as well. So in Scotland we have 8 different curricular areas that the curriculum is split into, but there are 3 main priorities and responsibilities of all, which are literacy, numeracy and health and wellbeing. They are seen as the kind of 3 main curricular areas that we do focus on in the primary school. If you didn't already know, then there is actually a Curriculum for Excellence app. I think there is an initial cost of about £10 to download it, but if you are a teacher in Scotland then I really recommend it because it saves so much time and you've just got everything digitally and you can quickly nip in and out to check, just a little bit like what I'm doing just now. Each curricular area is divided down into the individual levels that I showed you earlier on, so early level, first level and second level, and within each of the levels there are targets that pupils need to achieve. These are known as pupil experiences and outcomes, or shortened sometimes to E's and O's. These can vary depending on the subject that you're looking at, so I've got a few examples that I'll talk you through just now. The experiences and outcomes for literacy, for example, tend to be like a little bit more fluid and open to interpretation. So here is an example of one for writing. I enjoy creating texts of my choice and I regularly select subject, purpose, format and resources to suit the needs of my audience. So as you can see, some people do interpret them as a bit vague. Here is an example of an experience and outcome for mathematics. I can accurately measure and draw angles using appropriate equipment, applying my skills to problems in context. I think it's important to point out that when you become a teacher, there's not this great big guidebook that you're handed on how to teach. The curriculum for excellence isn't like a syllabus or a big package of materials. When the curriculum was introduced, it was a kind of Marmite type situation. Some people loved it because as a teacher, it allows you a lot of flexibility within your classroom, and you can be really innovative with the learning experiences that you provide your pupils with. But in the same sense, a lot of teachers hate it because it's not very prescriptive. Some of the experiences and outcomes are quite vague. So the benchmark statements were created, which give a little bit more clarity, a little bit more guidance, and expand on the experiences and outcomes. These are there to help you better plan and assess for learning. So let's have a look at an example. The experience and outcome for rounding within maths says, I can use my knowledge of rounding to routinely estimate the answer to a problem, then after calculating, decide if my answer is reasonable, sharing my solution with others. The benchmark really helps you to unpick that experience and outcome and work out exactly what the learning experience is that pupils are going to be doing in order to achieve it. So the benchmark for the one I just showed you says rounds whole numbers to the nearest 1,000, 10,000 and 100,000. So there you go, it's showing you exactly what those pupils are trying to achieve within that lesson. Rounds decimal fractions to the nearest whole number to 1 decimal place and 2 decimal places, and applies knowledge of rounding to give an estimate to a calculation. So it just provides a lot of clarity. These are the standards that we'll be measuring pupils against in order to assess their achievement. Something I'll point out is that with experience you do gain a better understanding of the experiences and outcomes. You become very familiar with them and you know the kind of expectations and learning experiences that you can create. When I'm planning for learning, I always make sure I use the benchmarks in order to make sure that pupils are achieving the targets that they are supposed to. Different local authorities and schools might also have forward planners, which they use for different curricular areas to organise the school year and individual terms, but that's really going to vary depending on the school that you're in. For example, in the authority that I'm currently teaching in, we have something called a maths pathway. That was a bit of a tongue twister. Maths pathway, and that helps me to know when I'm going to visit individual topics of maths throughout the school year. Similarly, most schools will have like a topic planner so that they prevent repetition across the stages, but as I said, it can vary from school to school. Some schools will have them, some schools might not, so it will be up to you to make sure you measure pupils against the benchmark statements and ensure that they are achieving what is expected of them at their stage. It's important to remember that they're not expected to cover the entire curriculum for each level over the course of a year. It's impossible to cover all of the experience and outcomes for one level within the course of 1 year. It is just so vast, there are so many different areas to be considered, so we do work towards them over the course of a few years, and that really allows pupils to get a good breadth of learning. Hopefully you guys are following okay so far. We're going to move on now to designing your learning intention and success criteria. So for the sake of today's video, we're going to be focusing on maths. I feel like maths is a really easy one because it's just so structured. We're going to be having a look at compass points and angles as the topic for the lesson that we're going to be teaching. As I said earlier, the first thing that I'm going to do is have a look at the relevant experiences and outcomes and the benchmark statement. This gives me a really clear idea of what pupils will be expected to learn over the course of this mini topic. You may want to use these as a way to map out a progression of lessons because pupils won't necessarily achieve all of this in just one session. You want to be able to assess their learning through lots of different contexts, through providing lots of different tasks. You don't always know how quickly learners are going to pick something up, so it's important to plan out the kind of stepping stones that you'd expect pupils to work through to get to the desired level of understanding. The first lesson in a topic is usually going to be introductory. It's going to be you assessing what they already know. Pupils should always be building on the knowledge that they already have. There should be progression between the different lessons as part of a topic, and at the end of the lesson there should always be clear next steps. By the end of the topic, you're really looking to challenge your pupils and what they've learned, but you need to be prepared to spend a little bit more time in a certain area if it is something pupils are struggling with. With maths, it can be quite tricky to plan too far ahead. You kind of need to wait and see how your pupils are getting on with a subject before they're ready to move on. Be prepared to spend a little bit longer on a specific aspect if it's something that they're struggling with. The experiences and outcomes and the benchmarks should allow you to create your learning intention and success criteria. Learning intentions are sometimes called learning outcomes, or I've seen people use the abbreviation WALT. we are learning to. This should be a sentence which states the main goal, the main intention of the learning. It's usually quite short and sweet. You don't want it to be too lengthy and confusing, and it usually has an action verb in it. It is important to make sure that this is phrased in child-friendly language that your learners are going to be able to understand, because you want them to understand the purpose of their learning, what it is they're trying to do. Could be to draw a portrait in the style of Picasso, to write a persuasive letter, to understand the link between directions and angles. So when you're teaching the lesson, make sure you go over this with the children. That's something that if you're being observed, then your assessor will be looking for. To be successful at the end of the lesson, pupils will need to achieve the success criteria, also sometimes called what I'm looking for, what the teacher is looking for. These are usually phrased in the form of I can statements. And this provides the pupils with key targets, things that they are trying to achieve during the lesson. Sometimes I'll actually work with the pupils to decide, what our success criteria is going to be. For example, if we're doing a writing lesson and our learning intention is to write a persuasive letter, then the success criteria, I might ask pupils, what do you think I'm looking for? What do you think you'll need to include in your letter in order to be successful today? And sometimes pupils will help me to come up with a list of the key things. Today's learning intention that we're going to be focusing on is to understand the link between compass directions and angles. An example of one of the I can statements that would be in our success criteria could be, I can label the directions on an 8-point compass. Now, depending on the abilities of your learners, you might want to differentiate your success criteria a little bit if you think that some pupils might be able to achieve more or less. I can identify the 3 golden rules for measuring bearings. I can use my knowledge of angles to solve direction problems. Those were a few examples that I managed to come up with off the top of my head. Usually the success criteria does relate to a task that pupils will be completing during the course of the lesson. My main advice would be to keep it short and sweet so that everyone is really clear on what is expected during the lesson, including the teacher. Moving on to the next section, which is my favourite section when it comes to lesson planning, and that is the learning journey. Now, the tricky part is always, how are you going to teach this? How are pupils going to achieve the desired learning? How is the lesson actually going to be structured? Sometimes you'll just feel inspired with a topic. You'll already have loads of ideas. You might be able just to sit down and mind map exactly what you'd like to do for that topic, but sometimes you might be a little bit unsure of a topic, especially if it's something that you've not really taught before. So something that I quite often do is I'll check the textbook. Textbooks can be really handy to use as a guide. Have a look at that topic and see the kind of activities that it suggests, the kind of progression that it suggests. This can be a really good way to map out the progression of lessons over the course of a week. Sometimes I'll go online and look for some inspiration, whether that's on some of the teacher resource sites like Twinkle, Teachers Pay Teachers, Teacher Education Scotland or TESS is also a really good one for resources. I'll quite often just search compass directions lesson and see the kind of things that other people have been doing. And of course, social media. If you don't already have a teacher Instagram or a teacher Twitter, then those are really great places for sharing ideas and inspiration. It's great to see what real teachers have also done in their classrooms and share examples of good practice. It's important to point out that you might have 6 lessons a day, 5 days a week. You're not always going to have the time to make every single lesson an outstanding one. Make sure you use your time wisely and set clear time limits when you're doing your planning. Be hard on yourself. Don't let yourself get carried away researching amazing lesson ideas. I could guarantee you that if I gave myself a whole weekend to plan, then I could fill that time. Pupils can complete textbook tasks or a worksheet and still achieve the learning intention. The more experience you have, the easier and quicker this process becomes. The most important thing is that pupils are achieving the desired outcome. If you didn't already know, as part of the Curriculum for Excellence in Scotland, we have a guide called the 7 Principles for Curriculum Design. They are really important aspects to take into consideration when you are planning for a learning experience. If you are interested, I'm going to touch on these in a little bit more detail, or I will include timestamps in the description if you want to skip on. So let's start with challenge and enjoyment. Children and young people should find their learning challenging and engaging and motivating. The curriculum should encourage high aspirations and ambitions for all. Breadth refers to all pupils having opportunities for a broad range of learning experiences. Their learning should be planned and organised so that they'll learn and develop through a variety of different contexts. Learning activities should combine to form a coherent experience. There should be clear links between different aspects of learning. Personalisation and choice refers to learning which is planned for children, that responds to their individual needs. It should also allow for opportunities for pupils to make choices about their own learning. Pupils should also understand the purpose of their learning. They should see the value of what they are learning and its relevance to their lives. I kind of touched on progression earlier, but we're always looking for pupils to build on the knowledge that they already have. We're always looking for those next steps, and pupils should be able to progress at a pace that is appropriate for them. Finally, there should be opportunities for children to develop their full capacity for learning by exploring areas in depth. These 7 principles must be taken into account when planning learning experiences for children and young people. These can also be used as a tool to improve and evaluate on your practice. It's also important at this stage to plan for your assessment. How are you going to assess pupils' learning? Quite often at the end of a lesson, I'll ask pupils to peer or self-assess, and they can do this in a number of ways. They can do it through writing a comment in their jotter. Quite often you see pupils colouring little traffic lights to show their understanding. Just through showing thumbs, I'll quite often go back to the success criteria and ask pupils to show me their thumbs depending on how confident they feel they were in achieving the success criteria. But then something you also want to think about is how you're going to summatively assess at the end of that topic. Are you going to have them complete an end of topic assessment? If it's art or literacy, do they have to create a final piece? There should be lots of different ways for pupils to provide evidence of their learning, and a good way to think about that when you're planning for learning and assessment is through the say, write, make and do, through talking about it and discussing their learning, through writing something down or answering something on paper, through making something, whether that's building a model to show their understanding, or through doing something. Are they acting something out? Are they modelling something, like how to do a somersault on the trampoline in PE? We know that pupils learn in lots of different ways, so it's important to assess them holistically and take into account their different learning styles when you are assessing them. Just because a pupil isn't able to answer a question in a summative test on paper doesn't mean that they can't explain something to you verbally. At the start of a lesson, I always like to check for pupils' prior knowledge, especially if it is a new topic that I'm introducing. I'll quite often do that through like a mind map on the interactive whiteboards, and I'll write down people's suggestions up there, or it can just be done through a class discussion. Questioning is such a good way to get pupils to think about their learning rather than just sitting passively listening to what you're telling them. So going back to our maths compass directions and angles lesson, I would probably start this off by having a discussion about compass points. Okay everyone, I've got a bit of a question for you. Can anyone tell me what we would use a compass for? Can anyone name any of the compass directions? Has anyone used a compass before? Posing questions helps to jog their memory and get them involved in their own learning. Who can remind me how many degrees there are in a full turn again? Rather than just telling them. There are 360 degrees in a full turn. After that, I will move on to my teaching input. I usually always use a PowerPoint or a flip chart. It's so important to point out that you will not have time to always make your own. It is so much easier to adapt something that is already pre-made, and I try and keep this process really interactive. I ask lots of questions. Okay everyone, here are the 3 golden rules for measuring bearings. In a moment, I am going to hide them off the screen, and I want to see if any of you can remember any of them. I like to try and include the use of whiteboards while I'm doing my teaching input. You could be talking for 15 minutes straight, and there will still always be those pupils that are lying with their head on the desk thinking about what's for lunch. So try and get them involved, get them active during your teaching input. Okay everyone, I'm going to show you an angle on the board, and on your whiteboards I would like you to estimate the size of that angle. During this lesson, as part of my teaching input, I asked pupils if any of them could think of a really good way of remembering the compass points. I give them 3 minutes to write down an example on their whiteboards, and then we voted for our favourite one. It doesn't need to be just you standing talking at them for 15 minutes. I always remember observing teachers while I was a trainee and thinking, how do they do that? How are they so good at that? But I can honestly say that with experience and confidence, it is just something that comes naturally. As a student teacher, you may initially have to start off with a kind of running script to help you make sure that you achieve all of the key things that you want to during a lesson, but writing it out like this will help you as you progress through your teaching career, because eventually you will no longer need the notes anymore. A huge tip that I have is to make sure you allow time in your lesson for modelling examples. This could be something as simple as modelling how you want pupils to lay out their jotters. Once you've rushed through your teaching input, sometimes it can be so tempting just to get them started on the task, but it is so important to spend lots of time explaining exactly what pupils will be expected to do so that there's no room for confusion. Pupils learn by example. Okay everyone, I would like you to open your jotters. Can we all write the date in the top left hand corner, just like I have on the board? Okay, and once you've done that, I would like you to write the learning intention. Please make sure you've taken a new line just like I have. Sometimes it can come across as a little bit patronising, but trust me, we learn through observations. Make sure you go over the first example with them so that they're really clear on what they're expected to do. So in the lesson example that I'm using for the sake of today's video, the first task that pupils were doing was making a model of a compass. I made sure to write clear step-by-step instructions on the board, which I talked the pupils through. This was the template that we were using, so it was just like a compass rose, and pupils were expected to label it with the different compass points and also with the relevant bearings that match up with the compass points. So I got people started off by asking them to remind me what the bearing was for north and south, and I wrote those examples on the template so that pupils could see exactly what they were expected to do. One way that I challenged pupils in my class that needed a little bit of an extra push was by including more of the compass points, so they would be expected to tell me the bearing for north-northeast as well as north and northeast. And for the pupils that needed a little bit of extra support, I provided them with labels that they could cut and stick onto their compass. Following this, pupils had a second task to complete, which they could actually use the compass that they had made to help support them with. I had a range of different questions. For example, I start at north and I turn 45 degrees clockwise. Where am I now facing? And pupils were expected to complete these in their jotters. Something that I use quite a lot when I'm differentiating learning is a chilli challenge, and I've got little cards that I made up at the start of my probation year, which I'll show you as well. Questions are sorted based on the heat, that's why it's called a chilli challenge. Pupils can decide what level they think is going to be best for them, depending on how confident they feel with a task. It's really nice to give pupils a bit of say in their own learning and let them make decisions, and you never know, some pupils might really surprise you and push themselves out of their comfort zone and try something, and it gives them an opportunity to really challenge themselves. If pupils are feeling slightly less confident, then I can always say to them, well, why don't you have a go at the middle one first, and then if you're feeling really good about that, then you can have a go at the challenging one. So I do really like using a chilli challenge across all of the different curricular areas. That kind of links to one of my final points, which is to always make sure you have some sort of extension task or an early finisher job. If you do have your own classroom, if you're an NQT or a qualified teacher, then it's good to have a station in your classroom where pupils can go to pick up any early finisher tasks. It might be an extra challenge worksheet, or it might just be a little job to keep them busy while the rest of the pupils finish off. And at the end of every lesson, it is good practice to try and make room for a plenary. I know how difficult this can be sometimes. We've all had those days where pupils are finishing off their jotter task and the bell rings for lunch and you're just not organised at all and you just have to bring the lesson to an end instantly. But it is really good to try and get pupils to reflect on their learning at the end of a lesson and evaluate how they're getting on. This can be very valuable, especially for your own observations as well. If there's a pupil that's feeling a little bit unconfident, then this is a really good time to pick up on that and help you to work out the next steps for the next lesson you're going to be teaching potentially the next day. Some teachers will have different marking trays that pupils can place their work into depending on how confident they were feeling, and that helps teachers to identify groups that might need a little bit of extra support the next day. As I said earlier on, you can use your formative assessment strategies, whether that's pupils writing a comment or colour coding their work. You can ask them to write a little comment. I've seen teachers do this really creatively. You can have like what are they called? Leaving slips. Some teachers will hand out a little resource for pupils to fill out. I've seen this done with tweets, where pupils will write a tweet about something they've learned during the lesson. It's just a little opportunity for them to reflect on what they've learned. Anyway, I hope you found this video interesting and helpful. It was a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of the Curriculum for Excellence and how I plan for my lessons. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask down below. I will try my very best to answer them. I would also be absolutely delighted if you wanted to share your own thoughts, tips and ideas in the comments section and get involved in the discussion down below. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to my channel for more teaching related content, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!